Hello and welcome to TUSB Conversation Starters. Today we are diving into a conversation that sits right at the intersection of geopolitics, global markets, and business strategy. I'm delighted to be joined by Juan Verde, a globally recognized strategist and advisor to the forefront of sustainable economic development, investment, and international partnership. As chairman of Vulcan Campania Minera, and founder of Aluma Solutions, Juan has advised leading organizations including Google, Cisco, American Express, and Banco Santander. A prominent voice in climate action and responsible business, he has contributed to global forums such as COP25 and COP26 and currently serves as president of the Advanced Leadership Foundation, mentoring the next generations of leaders. Juan, it's a pleasure to have you and thank you for joining us.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Let's start with a broad understanding of what's happening. Now, we look at the world right now, which is going in all directions. What do you feel that geopolitics is becoming the main driver in economic and business decision? And how would you describe the current geopolitical situation presently? If you see the global south and the global north, what are the fault lines which are shaping this movement?
Very good question. I would describe it as a transition from a world that was primarily driven by globalization and finding the cheapest products anywhere in the world to where we are heading now. We are heading towards a very different world, one where we are beginning to see resilience, national security, or even strategic competition as the priority. However, this transformation, I would say that it's not only about changes in globalization. It is, I think, more importantly, about the erosion, the loss of influence, if you will, of the multilateral system that we knew, the multilateral system that defined the rules of the game for decades. For decades, we knew what the rules of the game were. But that's changing. Institutions used to provide stability. They were predictable, and they always gave the rest of the world a common framework for international cooperation. And again, that's losing influence now. We're witnessing a world that is very different because geopolitical interests are now becoming more important than multilateral consensus. What do I mean by that? To me at least, the world is now becoming more about diplomacy that is transactional, that is more opportunistic in nature. And so, to answer your question in a brief manner, I would say that business leaders today are having to navigate a world that is a lot more fragmented. It is less predictable, and it is also a world that is influenced by national interests, strategic competition, security considerations. So it's it's uncertain. It is
Hmm.
now less about ideology and values, and it's more about interest and control. Those are the new key terms.
Right. So, answer you, it's pretty interesting what you mentioned about multilateralism, which is just going away, and it's a transactional relationship which people are having. But in this entire scenario, when we have large multinational corporations, if you can elaborate that, the challenges which these guys are facing.
Well, multilateral entities are now becoming less influential, less relevant. Unfortunately, perhaps because of the United States and China understanding that reciprocity is no longer uh, the term that it's most important, they are now engaging countries, nations, they are now engaging in a bilateral manner. And they're not necessarily interested in um, to give an example, the United States for decades was more interested in developing a system that had clear rules for everybody. That's no longer the case. It is now understanding that it has to redefine or reset the game, and it's now more transactional in nature. That's creating a world that is a lot more uncertain.
Hmm. Okay. Is there any particular sector which is feeling the brunt of this situation which we're experiencing right now? I mean, let's take the example of you've categorically mentioned US and China, but are the sectors on technology, energy, manufacturing, or finance, or is it all of them?
Absolutely. Obviously, technology, energy, robotics, advanced manufacturing, semiconductors, or even defense. These are all very, very important sectors. But I think this geopolitical force is having an impact on pretty much every sector around the world. Critical minerals, rare earths, all these sectors are undergoing significant transformation. And why? Because they are now becoming closely linked to national security. So it's no longer just about economic competitiveness. Now nations are understanding that national security and strategic autonomy is as important, if not more. So, of course, technology and energy are probably the most geopolitical sensitive sectors today. There is no competitiveness without access to reliable sources of energy. And we're seeing that around the world, and particularly China and the United States, are fighting each other for technological supremacy. So those are the most evident ones. But I think it's pretty much everything. Every industry now is at the center of economic growth, national security, and international competition. So in this new world, I think that the winners of this geopolitical race will be countries and even companies actually that
Mhm.
are able to invest in innovation, infrastructure, energy security, and as I mentioned, also technological leadership.
So, if you can just pinpoint which will be the losers or the winners in this in this fight which is happening. Any specific sector?
Yes. So rather than going into sectors, I think that I'm more comfortable defining what the winners look like and how they behave, and what the losers look like and how they behave. So, as I mentioned, the winners are going to be companies that are investing long term in innovation, infrastructure, and technological uh, advantage. But the losers are going to be those that remain extremely dependent on a single market or on a single supplier. The losers are going to be the ones that don't diversify their risk. And I think the losers will be the ones that continue to see the world not for what it is or for what it's becoming, but for what they wish it still was. The world has changed and there is no turning back.
Hmm. And plus, because you've mentioned because of the supply chain, are you seeing companies thinking of rethinking their supply chains, manufacturing bases changing, even market exposure? You know, what are the some of the most important strategic calibrations you're observing among global corporations?
Well, I've mentioned diversification. To me,
Hmm.
that's one of the biggest change. Companies are reducing dependence on single suppliers or single geographies. Companies and even nations are creating incentives for suppliers to produce closer to home or at least more regionally. And so we're beginning to see how companies are building more resilient supply chains, plan A, plan B. They are investing in regional production hubs. And so certainly that's a trend, and that's something that is very, very important.
Hmm.
But don't get me wrong, I finding the cheapest supplier remains important. That's not going to change in the short term. What I think is changing is that resilience is increasingly becoming a strategic priority. In most cases, I see companies now diversifying rather than complete abandonment of a country or a market. I just
Hmm.
don't see a situation like we used to have in the Cold War, where certain countries chose not to trade with other major powers. I don't see that in the future. I think we're moving in a direction where companies will want flexibility, they will want resilience, but they're not going to act um, in isolation, if you will.
Hmm.
So those trends are clearly accelerating um, changes. Businesses are increasingly choosing to locate production closer to customers or within countries. We're now talking about friendshoring, which I think is an interesting term. It's not just nearshoring, it's now friendshoring, finding markets and finding hubs and distribution networks in places where or with whom you have a good relationship.
Hmm.
And by the way, we're going to have to pay more for that. Just to give you an idea, before COVID, the United States used to get about 90% of its antibiotics from China. Think about what that says about your national security if your antibiotics or even fertilizers, right? Before COVID, 23% of all the fertilizers that we used in the United States came from either China, Russia, or the countries of the former Soviet Union. That puts you in a very vulnerable situation. And I don't think we're going back there. I think that it leaves places like Europe, India, uh, Brazil, certainly the United States in a very vulnerable situation. So we are understanding that the world we're moving into is going to be very different. It's going to be more diversified, and it's going to
Hmm.
have a lot more sources.
Yeah. Juan, you said very interesting thing which just caught my attention. You said that suppliers should be, organizations are looking for suppliers which are close to home. But however, for example, if you are a firm which is there in technology and you need rare earth, you still have you have to go to one major supplier, right? How will you cut down on that part where you don't have a supplier closer to home? How will you manage that then?
Well, you touched upon something that is very, very sensitive, which is critical minerals and rare earths. That right now, it's pretty evident that China has a supremacy. The latest numbers that I've seen show that when it comes to rare earths, for example, it's not just that they produce close to 75% of all the rare earths in the world, it's that they process almost 93%. So even if you're able to produce and mine rare earths, you still have to send them to China to be processed. That is, I think, an exception, if you will. We're going to have to find sources either in our own countries or near our countries. But to answer your question, it's going to become an issue of learning how to do more with less. We're going to have to recycle more. We're going to have to reuse more. We're going to have to uh, produce, mine, and develop sources that are closer to home or in friendly countries. So it's not just one or the other. I think it's a little bit of everything. We're going to have to depend less. We're going to have to produce more, and we're going to have to be more efficient with what we have.
Uh-huh. So there are a lot of geopolitical tensions then, right? And you don't have a one single supplier. You just need to diversify and find the right one for you and closer to home. So, is this leading to a more fragmented global trading system?
Oh my God, absolutely. We're definitely moving towards a more complex trading system. But by the way, globalization is not disappearing. It's evolving. Capital is not going away. It's not evaporating. Capital is being redirected, and the same thing happens with globalization. Trade is becoming more regional, more strategic, more influenced by geopolitical considerations. What do I mean by that? In the future, where your company is based will matter. Where your jurisdiction or the jurisdiction of you or potential conflict will matter. And so we are seeing the emergence of a new reality, trade corridors, stronger partnerships among countries seeking to have resilience and security first and foremost. And as I mentioned before, having to pay more for that security. I'll give you an example. The United States depended on China for pretty much everything. Europe depended on China for pretty much everything. But unlike Europe, the United States has made a very important decision to diversify its sources. Mexico is now our largest trade partner, and it has been for the last 3 years. Companies are willing to pay more from products from China, but I'm sorry, from Mexico, but they're doing it because they have to stop relying on one particular market. So um, again, I mentioned terms like friendshoring or national production are now back in uh, in everyone's vocabulary, and particularly these are now terms that are being discussed at the corporate advisory boards of many corporations around the world. And by the way, this is happening for the first time in many decades.
Mm. That's right. I mean, it's very, how do I put it? It's pretty alarming also. That means this will also, there's a capital flow which is also shifting then, right? It can be
Oh,
moving from from developed to the emerging market.
absolutely, absolutely. And by the way, it's that's not to say that uh, that foreign direct investment into emerging markets is gone. Absolutely not. These markets are very important because of their um, potential growth, because of their internal markets. The emerging markets are important because they are home to rare earths, uh, critical minerals, uh, and the demographics. Emerging markets are growing more rapidly than more mature markets. So absolutely, capital is flowing, but it's not disappearing. It's just going into more uh, strategic sectors like uh, critical infrastructure, like national security, like defense, like clean technologies, and so on. So investors are now thinking long term, understanding that things change very rapidly, but you have to uh, understand where you want to be 10, 20 years from now.
Okay, now let's zoom to United States. It's the world's largest economy. How do you currently see the US position within the geopolitical and economic realignment which is happening?
That's a good word. Thank you. Realignment is it's to me what's truly happening, and understanding that I think gives clarity to what's happening around the world. To answer your question, the United States, in my opinion, remains well positioned. It continues to lead in innovation. It continues to lead in entrepreneurship, innovation, technology, higher education, capital markets. And by the way, its ability to attract talent, entrepreneurs, and investment continues to be high. Even we're beginning to see new industries, particularly fueled by disruptive technologies. And so all of that, I think, continues to give the United States a good comparative advantage in the global economy. So my concern is not whether the United States can compete in the future. It's competing, and I think it stands to continue to compete for a while. I'm more concerned with whether the United States can sustain and even expand that leadership over the long term. I was saying before that companies need to think today more than ever in the long term. Why? Because we in the United States need to accelerate investment in the strategic sectors that are going to define whether we continue to be competitive in decades down the line. And so we have to invest more in basic science, advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, clean energy. I think we're not talking enough about clean energy and how that becomes extremely critical because it makes us less dependent on others. We have to continue to invest in education or even research and development. So, um, in summary, the United States will continue to be competitive, but for the very first time in a very long time, it has to stop giving priority to the short-term thinking. Uh, we need Politicians in the U.S. need to start thinking about the next generations and not just the next elections. Um, and frankly, the United States' strength remains extraordinary, but it
Mm.
has to preserve its leadership. It has to be more consistent with long-term planning. It is not easy for democracies. By the way, it's easier for China or other autocracies. They can have the luxury of thinking long-term and not thinking about the next political cycle. So that's the challenge going forward.
So next, you've given us a futuristic understanding of how US will be released, but in the coming next few months, what are the key developments should markets and international investors be paying attention to in the US?
Um, I think investors should be paying much more attention to geopolitical developments and not just economic indicators. Next few months are going to be critical because, for example, I would be monitoring developments in the Middle East. I would be interested in understanding whether the tensions involving Iran, Israel, and the United States are going to continue for months to come. That will have a huge impact on the investment scenario around the world, on international trade, on inflation, prices, supply chain, and so on. So I think to me, that's one key factor I would be looking at. And by the way, what I would be looking at is whether these conflicts move towards de-escalation or, on the contrary, if they become more prolonged. That will definitely have significant implications on global economic stability. The second thing I would be looking at, perhaps more regionally, is Venezuela in Latin America. Why? Because this is an experiment. We had never seen the United States be so involved in a region and remove a president and have a very strong influence in the country. So I think that's a test case for the U.S. and particularly in how it engages in the Western Hemisphere. The United States is now seeing the Western Hemisphere as an area of influence to again to have supply chains closer to home. Third, I would be interested, given all this geopolitical tension, I would be looking at how China and the United States try to resolve their differences in the next few months between now and December. I would be watching whether both countries begin to seek greater cooperation, because at the end of the world, they are facing many common challenges. And so, are they going to work closer, or are they going to drift apart even more? So that's going to have a consequence on trade, technology, supply chain, investment flows. And finally, I think in the next few months between now and the end of the year, I would be actually looking at what happens in the United States. We have midterm elections on November 3rd. It's going to have a huge impact on whether President Trump is going to be able to continue to govern without any opposition. And so right now he has a lot of power. It's a very presidential country, but that might change if the Republicans lose control or lose the majority in Congress. If that happens, and by the way, I think it's likely to happen according to the latest polls, the last 2 years of his administration might be more limiting in terms of how much he can do both domestically and when it comes to foreign policy. So that I think it's one last thing that I would be looking at, because the markets are going to be looking for signals regarding trade policy, industrial strategy, or even America's role in the world.
Hmm. So this is a very chaotic situation, right? And if you are a global investor or a multinational company leader, what should be the mindset which you need to have to navigate this environment, which is just changing day by day?
Yes, it's changing day by day, and I don't want to sound pessimistic because that's not the spirit of my message here. But uh, I uh, I would be telling investors and business executives that the key mindset shift is understanding that uncertainty is no longer temporary. Uncertainty is no longer the exception. It is now the norm. And by the way, uncertainty is now structural. We have to understand that first and foremost. And just as importantly, leaders, particularly in the business world, they have to recognize that the geopolitical environment that shaped our world, that shaped the last several decades, that has fundamentally changed and is, I think, most likely not going to return. Doesn't matter who wins the next elections in the United States. It doesn't matter what happens between Russia and Europe. The era of relatively predictable, stable globalization, the era of stable supply chains, low prices, and by the way, and broadly accepted international multilateral entities that defined an international order that's behind us. So I think companies and investors can no longer assume that the conditions that drove success in the past 30 years is actually going to define the next 30 years. I think this is a before and after. And this new environment requires a different strategic framework. It requires a new way of thinking about business, about being competitive. Um, I think the new world that is emerging now places greater emphasis on resilience, diversification, adaptability, and by the way, geopolitical awareness. I think that that's important to
Mm.
mention. I see a world where we will have a geopolitical officer in countries, not just the chief financial officer. You see a chief geopolitical officer, because success is going to depend on the ability to manage risk and be able to identify opportunities simultaneously. So you look at risk and then you say, um, oh, wow, these opportunities are actually being created by disruption. So how do I get ahead of the game? The most successful organizations in the future are the ones that are going to understand that this period of transformation and change is going to create challenges, but also huge opportunities. So you just have to be ready. And by the way, I mentioned this before, but you have to be thinking about long-term positioning. Yes, a ever-changing world, things are going to be more short-term volatility. They're going to be based on changing scenarios, but the direction has to be very clear. You have to know where you want to be 10 years down the line. So geopolitical reality is a key factor for understanding the world that's coming.
Yeah. So my last question to you, Juan, is so okay, we have CXOs, right? So we have CEO, CFO, CSO, now we have a Chief Geopolitical Officer. So one thing which a multinational leader has to keep on reminding themselves in this geopolitical moment, which is you have to keep an eye on it. What's that one key idea which they should keep in mind every day?
I would wake up in the morning thinking about not the world I wish we had, but about the world we are now having to face. So, in a world defined by uncertainty, resilience has become the new competitive advantage. The organizations that can adapt, diversify, innovate, and think strategically over the long term are the ones that are going to be best positioned to succeed in the years ahead. That to me would be um, the most important message.
Right. Juan, thank you so much for your clear and insightful breakdown of what is complex but very incredible to understand that wow, how this entire global system is changing. And what you've just told us today, the Chief Geopolitical Officer, I think organizations should keep that in mind. That's a new upcoming post. Thank you very much again, and lovely chatting up with you.
Thank you, Khan. It's been a pleasure.